Trust in politics is broken, so can we get UK politics working again?
That was the last time we were happy. 2012.
I'm Beth Rigby, Sky's political editor. Join me every week with Labour's Jess Phillips and Conservative peer Ruth Davidson for some electoral dysfunction.
This idea of nuance has completely left politics.
Yeah. Together, we'll focus on the policies that could deliver political satisfaction. Follow Electoral Dysfunction wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, this is Mark Austin, sitting in on this Sky News Daily. On this episode, Angela Rayner, the woman who could be Deputy Prime Minister by the end of the year, and those questions about her tax affairs. We'll explain what's being claimed, at least, about her apparently failing to pay capital gains tax on a house sale almost a decade ago. She insists she's taken expert advice, which shows that she's done nothing wrong. But also, we'll ask if this is something that's really in the public interest, or is it more of a smear, as her Labour colleague David Lammy has claimed. We'll also look at how important Angela Rayner is to Labour's election ambitions with polling expert Scarlett Maguire. But let's start with Sky News political correspondent Rob Powell. So Rob, help us out here. It's quite complicated. What is she meant to have done? How much money is at stake? And what's involved?
Yeah, the detail is complicated, but actually the sort of broad premise of the story is a kind of classic of the genre over honesty and whether Angela Rayner has been telling the truth about her living arrangements a decade ago. The revelations, the allegations were first made in a book biography, an unauthorised biography of Angela Rayner published by the former Conservative donor anyway, Lord Ashcroft, a couple of months ago. What he is alleging is that she had a property in Greater Manchester that she bought under right to buy. It was an ex-council house, and then she sold it and made some money from that sale. Now, that's perfectly legitimate, but if it's not your main residence, then you have to pay capital gains tax because it's sort of seen as an investment. And this is where the complicating factor basically comes in, because in the years running up to that sale, her husband had lived in the broader area as well, with her children. So the allegation essentially that is being made is that while she was saying that this property that she owned was her main residence, actually her main residence was her husband's home a short distance away, and she had been living there but had essentially told the taxman that the other property was her main residence. Now this may be irrelevant because, and this is where we get deep into the weeds of tax law, which I don't really want to do. If you're in a couple, you can declare that one of your homes is your primary residence. It's irrelevant whether you're actually living there or not. As long as you're not renting it out, you are able to do this. The difficulty is Angela Rayner's response is saying, look, this was my main residence. I lived there. I sold it, as lots of people do. This is all a smear. The Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday have been doing a lot of digging through social media posts, essentially trying to prove that statement from Angela Rayner wrong.
Her answer to what you have just been outlining is nothing to see here. In fact, it's more than nothing to see here. It's nothing to see here. And by the way, I took tax advice and the tax advisor said nothing to see here.
Yeah, it is that I've consulted with a tax advisor, a tax lawyer. I've got a piece of paper that says that this is all completely legit, but I'm not going to publish that because as she says, she doesn't think that politicians should have to publish personal tax advice like this. She says her team have seen it, that Sir Keir Starmer's team have seen it, even though Sir Keir Starmer hasn't, that this is all completely legitimate and essentially this is a smear campaign being drummed up by the right-wing press.
Yeah. How much pressure? I mean, the Daily Mail have now, as you said, have been digging through 10 years or so of socials and social media and have found this, I've just got home to the dogs and, happy to be home. And that home doesn't seem to be the home that she originally bought.
Yeah, they've been sort of picking out kind of cushions on the sofa and matching it up with other photos from that house to try and show that at this point that she wasn't living in this home that she had bought individually. She was living with her husband and her children. There's also been some sort of work looking at property advertisements posted online and some kind of the appearances of rooms and the garden being overgrown, essentially trying to reach a conclusion about whether this place looked like it had been her main residence in the run-up to her selling it. What's causing, I think, political harm for Angela Rayner on this is not necessarily the sort of nuts and bolts of the story. Like, it's difficult to know how much capital gains tax might be paid if these stories are correct, but it's not big numbers. You know, you're talking about sort of £1,500, maybe up to £3,000, but it's so complicated. If she'd done lots of renovations to the place, then it might be nothing. So it's not really about that. It is about what she has said and whether she's telling the truth. And I think what doesn't help Angela Rayner in this is that she is someone that goes on the offensive against Conservative politicians over sort of misdemeanours. You know, she got into a lot of trouble for calling Tories scum once, something she apologised for. And I think what goes through lots of people's heads when they think about this story is, if this was a Conservative minister that had legitimate questions hanging over the sort of honesty and the transparency of comments they've been making, would Angela Rayner be out there for Labour demanding maximum transparency and that they clear all this stuff up?
And on investigations into this, so where are we on all that?
Greater Manchester Police decided not to investigate, but then they said that they were reviewing that decision after senior Conservative figures, I think it was the deputy chairman of the party, essentially appealed for them to reinvestigate it. To complicate it further, what the police are looking in for is would be looking into, and they're not investigating this, but what they would be looking into and what Tories are urging them to look into is slightly different. It's about whether Angela Rayner has broken electoral law.
Yeah.
About whether she had registered on the electoral register at her primary address. Because if she had registered at the address in Stockport that she bought and she wasn't living there, that wasn't a primary address, then the allegation from the Conservative side is that she may have broken electoral law. So that is what Tories want the police to look into, which is, again, a little bit separate.
Thanks, Rob. We'll hear more from you later in the podcast. I'm joined now by Scarlett Maguire, Director of Polster's JL Partners. So, Scarlett, first of all, how do you think it cuts through? I mean, the Daily Mail are driving it seems to me, more than anybody else.
Just in terms of focus groups and things coming up sort of relatively organically when you ask people about their views of individual politicians, this has not really cut through yet. That might be because it's not getting sort of wider pickup elsewhere. It might be because it's not a particularly catchy scandal. It's quite hard, if it is a scandal, it's quite hard to explain. I think, though, there might be a slight caveat in that this was the case with that sort of beergate, Keir Starmer in Durham during the pandemic. And actually that didn't cut through right up until the point that it did. And despite the fact that it was cleared by police, we still had people bringing it up in focus groups sort of years later, actually, as an example of how all politicians are just the same and just as bad as each other.
If it does start to cut through, Scarlett, how difficult would it be for Labour? How important is she to Keir Starmer?
Angela Rayner is an interesting figure, I think, within the Labour Party. She's better known than a lot of the shadow cabinet, so that's a pretty low bar. That's to be expected. Normally, opposition politicians, especially when they've been out of government for so long, you wouldn't expect them to have particularly high name recognition. But she's up there. I mean, some polls have her as better known even than Rachel Reeves, but regardless, she is sort of Keir Starmer, Ed Miliband, Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner tend to be the figures that people have actually heard of and know a little bit about. She's also actually quite a divisive figure, so we find that she's sort of better liked by people, but also more disliked. And especially, actually, if you think about what the sort of Labour strategy has been, or what it seems to have been from the outside over the last 18 months, which is less appealing to its core vote, thinking they'll swing behind it anyway to get the government out, more in trying to win over, or at least not scare, people who voted Conservative in 2019. And she's actually very unpopular with those voters, from polling data anyway. She's sort of been quite out of the spotlight. She's not been doing many media appearances over the last few months, even before this sort of came into the headlines. And that maybe potentially explains why, because she's not appealing to the sort of voters that Labour are particularly interested in targeting at the moment. Right.
It said she fulfills a similar role to John Prescott for Tony Blair. I mean, is that right?
Yeah, I think there is something to be said for that. So people tend to have some of the similar criticisms about Keir Starmer, or rather their criticisms are very similar. So it tends to be that he doesn't know what he stands for. He's just sort of like another politician, not really saying anything, triangulating too much to try and work out what voters think rather than just saying it as it is. Angela Rayner is not viewed like that. So a lot of people do say, and actually in focus groups, some people will say, I just wish Keir Starmer was a lot more like Angela Rayner and just, said what he thought, and then we'd know where he stands. I think we should see more more of Angela Rayner, but for every person that says that, there's normally someone else in the focus group that rolls their eyes and say, oh no, can't stand her, please get her off the radio. So you can sort of see why they're treading cautiously, but I do think someone like Angela Rayner can act as a good foil from sort of some of Keir Starmer's blandness, or at least, his perception of blandness anyway.
And you spoke about Beergate and how that eventually did start to register with the voters. What would it take, do you think, for this to be a story that the voters start to notice?
I think that's a difficult question, partly because voters, despite the fact that it's an election year, are actually pretty tuned out. So more and more people that we speak to say they actually have just stopped engaging with news. They find it too depressing, especially with politics, actually. But there's quite a lot of apathy. So actually it's harder, I think, to register things with voters. That applies to the Conservative Party. We've seen that hurt them. There's nothing that Rishi Sunak can really say which seems to land with voters. But it also, I think, applies for something like this. I think a lot of the time it's met with a sort of eye roll. People have quite low expectations of politicians anyway. Trust in them is at a sort of historic low, at least in terms of recent history. And so they just add this to sort of thinking, oh, well, they're all pretty bad. They're all in it for themselves. Move on next, please. When
it comes to these seats that they lost in 2019, is she quite key in getting them back, do you think?
No, I actually don't think she is necessarily. So again, that's sort of when we talk about her appeal, it's interesting because she is, say, more popular actually with certain demographics than quite a lot of other Labour frontbenchers. Problem is she's also quite significantly more unpopular. It looks like she might be, with those voters, potentially more of a liability than an asset. So that must change sort of how they're thinking about her. Again, she's not actually, despite the fact that, as you quite rightly say, they're standing by her at the moment, they've not been putting her front and centre very much, especially for someone that's, like a deputy prime minister, you think might be out and about on the airwaves a bit more.
What is her value then, do you think?
I think her value is that she comes from the trade union movement. I think she's seen to be standing up for workers' rights. I think she is seen to be speaking for a group of people that potentially are otherwise unrepresented. And again, I think there is a value in having someone that seems like, that is more obviously from a working class background. Something that criticism, again, that Keir Starmer gets quite a lot in focus groups anyway, is that he's posh. There's part of that is because of the title. But other part of that is also because he presents like quite a lot of other politicians in suits, and people sort of assume certain things about his background and his education, which they just don't assume about Angela Rayner.
What's your sense about how it will play out? I mean, the Daily Mail, they're not giving up, are they? That's for certain. I mean, they've got this stuff about the social media posts and I'm getting home to the dogs and I've just got home and so forth. I mean, they're not letting up, are they?
Yeah, it does look like they won't let Labour forget this one or move past this one. But again, if nothing comes out that sort of more concretely proves that there is something fraudulent going on there or whatever it may be, I think it's quite hard to see how this properly sticks. But let's see what we get into. We've also seen, I think, a Labour operation which is not particularly agile, which is quite prone to making mistakes. So potentially, if they're put under enough pressure, they might, sort of have an own goal and mess it up on their own terms. But I mean, let's see what happens.
How will that look in an election year? As we get closer to the election, do you think that voters will see it in a different light to how they're seeing it now?
I mean, they could potentially, as they start paying more attention to the news cycle and the election cycle. We do find that people tend to tune in as soon as a campaign goes off, then people can actually start paying more attention. Partly that's because you have manifestos, you have actual things on the table. So it may be that it changes then. But I think as things stand, I'd be slightly sceptical. But, again, anything could happen.
Absolutely. Scarlett, thank you very much. OK, let's pause there. We'll be back after the break with more analysis on how Angela Rayner might ride this out. Let's just talk about the politics of all this then and have a listen to what Keir Starmer is saying.
Angela Rayner's been asked no end of questions about this. She's answered them all. She said she's very happy to answer any further questions from the police or from any of the authorities. I don't need to see the legal advice. My team has seen it. But I will say this, that on the day that the A&E figures, people waiting more than 24 hours in A&E, we now know that they are 10 times as high as they were 5 years ago. The idea that the Tories want to be focusing on what Angela Rayner, how much time she spent with her ex-husband 10 years ago, I can tell you here, at this hospital, nobody is interested in that. They're very, very interested in what are you going to do about the A&E problem caused by this government.
OK, Rob Powell, so that's what Keir Starmer is saying about it. How do you think this will play out? We've had David Lammy on the political programmes basically saying, well, defending Angela Rayner and saying that, he's confident that she's done nothing wrong. So, I mean, he's not saying, well, it's up to Angela, these are her affairs. This is a pretty stout defence.
But the thing is, the defence from Labour hasn't really changed over the last 2 months since this story first broke. It's sort of right from the beginning been, she took tax advice, she did nothing wrong, she's confident about that, but we're not publishing it because we don't think we need to. And that hasn't been enough so far to shut this story down. I think we will highly likely see more stories of the type we've had this weekend, especially, I think, in newspapers. They're like a dog with a bone when they get stories like this, and they feel that there's more and more and more. I think they will keep pushing unless there is something that really can shut it down. More and more, you're finding that journalist reporters are sort of treating Labour like they're a government in waiting now in terms of ramping up the scrutiny on them. And I think as we get close to the general election, there'll be more, there's inevitably going to be more stories of this nature, or the scrutiny of policy is going to ramp up as well. And what really matters is how the Labour machine handles that, whether it can kind of shut this stuff down before it starts to spiral and take political chunks out of them. And so far for this story, they haven't been able to do that.
Right, so how they handle it going forward will depend on whether there's anything else coming out in the papers and whether, presumably, the police do decide to investigate.
I think if the police launched an investigation, then that's a real headache for Labour. And I think you can point at other examples. The scandal over the Rochdale candidate Azhar Ali, when comments around the war in Gaza were reported after the nominations had closed. Labour initially stood by him when it seemed pretty clear to a lot of people that actually eventually they would have to disown their candidate. It took Labour quite a long time to get to that point of disowning him. And in that sort of intervening period, a lot of political damage was done, which is why I think all of this put together leads to kind of bigger systemic questions over sort of strategic decision-making in Labour, how to close something down before it can really take chunks out of you. And when this might not matter so much now because the eyes of the electorate maybe aren't paying close attention to every nuance and twist and turn of stories like this. But when we get into a general election and people are paying attention, stories like this can escalate and spiral. And if you haven't got an effective machine at Labour HQ that's able to shut it down before it really kind of turns into a behemoth that eats the whole party, that's when it can get really difficult.
But sometimes a political figure comes along who is so important to a leader that the leader decides, I really do not want to lose this person. Do you think that could ever reach that stage with Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer?
Sir Keir Starmer, I think, will want to do everything possible not to lose Angela Rayner because I think she fills in a lot of the gaps politically that he has. There are those kind of Blair Prescott parallels. You've kind of got Sir Keir Starmer, who is the sort of more loyally kind of formal politician, and then you've kind of got the more outspoken deputy there. The other part of this is how it plays out within the party as well. A few years ago now, Sir Keir Starmer attempted a reshuffle in which he initially tried to demote Angela Rayner. Didn't quite happen. She pushed back. There was a degree of outrage within the party towards it, and she ended up essentially getting a better job. Yeah. If he was to kind of cut Angela Rayner loose or force her out at this point, which I don't think he bluntly will want to do everything he possibly can to avoid that, then it potentially stores up more problems further down the line. Because I think when you're looking at kind of rivals for the throne within Labour, Angela Rayner is probably one of them with her own support base within the party. So I think he will want to try and keep her as close as possible.
That's all for today. My thanks to Scarlett and to Rob. Neil Patterson will be back tomorrow.